This episode is brought to you by The Skeptical Buddha, The Tao of Science, my book, which is a thoughtful discourse on Eastern philosophy and how it helped birth ideas required for science and skepticism and the way it fell behind in the face of new evidence. This book discusses the long history of both philosophies as well as the tenets and variations within the varying sects, along with psychology and our own natural biases. It discusses how to counter our natural biases using science and the underlying concepts of meditation and mindfulness, a more complex understanding of how science operates than most of the public understands, and why it is the best tool we have to discover truth and reality, as well as philosophical ideas we might embrace as technology progresses. The material is packaged in a way that the average person can understand, with rich illustrations to draw the reader in and feel at peace. Welcome to After School Democracy, the podcast that attempts to fill in the gaps you almost certainly missed in school about politics, economics, and history. The U.S. suburbs, from their very inception, were an unsustainable racist Ponzi scheme of inequality and, in many cases, wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. Gonna make some friends with suburbanites straight off the bat here. The suburbs started out from day one as a luxury of the rich, who would work in the dirty, stinky city, which they caused, which made tons of money off of polluting, and then take the coach or a train to their estate just outside the city. Stately Wayne Manor was in one of these rich suburbs. After World War II, when the troops returned home, there was a huge housing shortage, and one of the parts of the GI Bill was low-interest loans for non-profit government-built housing. This was the beginning of government housing, which evolved from good quality housing for white people to low quality housing for black people, often as just a way to take away and displace them from their land. And yes, it was good quality housing for white people. Black troops were not allowed, for the most part, to take advantage of any part of the GI Bill, and certainly weren't allowed in these newly built government housing neighborhoods. In fact, part of the agreement of this loan was they were not to sell their homes to minorities. Once again, just like with the Homestead Act, white people getting handouts at the expense of minorities. See more on my video as to how we could both pay some reparations to make up for redlining and fix the housing crisis at the same time. These worked well as ways to segregate whites from blacks, but then at a point, the courts decided this was illegal. So as a way to legally extend segregation, they invented single-family zoning. This involved expanding the individual plots of land each house must be built on to reduce the chances of minorities being able to afford these houses. Minorities gradually started to move into these once segregated, more compact neighborhoods, and white people moved further to the borders of the towns, in the de facto whites-only neighborhoods, where they could afford the land, afford to own and commute by car daily, and afford the property taxes needed to maintain the utilities, as tax density for maintenance was a fraction of what it was in the city. As more influential voters moved more and more to the edges of the city, they were able to pass laws with the help from the car lobby to subsidize the roads and utilities in these new suburbs at the expense of the people with a higher tax density. They also began requiring minimum street parking in the cities and minimum parking in the newer suburban retail districts, which was once again a cost to people who did not own cars and had to pay for it with higher cost of goods. This pushed the government to basically create road construction on the Soviet-style planned economy, as once the numbers of users reached a need, they would just immediately expand the roads. This ensured that while 100 years ago a child could safely wander 5 miles in a city and parents didn't think anything about it, a child leaving their yard or cul-de-sac was now considered parental neglect or child abuse, as they could get hit by a car very easily. This forced everyone to have to own a car, which allowed, through political maneuvering, to ensure that you had to go through a dealership to get a new car, which added extra middleman cost on, thanks to the fact that while you may think you're getting a good deal through haggling, the house always wins. Add insurance and maintenance, especially in the heavily populated city that requires either expensive yearly inspections or toxic smog, and you ended up turning this wonder machine of an automobile that was amazing for the right uses and turned it into a corporate subservience, and not owning one was a sign of lacking maturity or moral fiber. It's a debt trap or money pit, and we are all required to have it just to survive. Because the city-subsidized suburbs were so lucrative for developers, they were able to use that data to push and sell unsubsidized suburbs as an investment that would always go up. It was great for the first 2 generations, but over time it's been shown to be a Ponzi scheme as maintenance costs of aging infrastructure made taxes too high, and many places are having to tear up their streets, replacing them with gravel, turning a once prestigious neighborhood into a trashy place to live, assuming they haven't figured out how to get the federal government to bail them out. And suburbs also hurt small farmers who have the cost and tax of their land go up too much, and when foreclosed, that land is much more likely to be sold to a real estate developer as opposed to another farmer. The suburbs have all the worst parts of the city and urban combined. Distance and inaccessibility of rural life, even more pollution and stress than being in the city, and with no way to get any natural exercise. The city should be able to have good public transit, but they are most often run by suburban dwellers who drive everywhere and don't want to give up some of their streets. They stole from us bicyclists, buses, and trolleys and pedestrians, then attack it as a war on cars when all we want is equal treatment. Add to this that while deaths of drivers have dropped with a rise of larger trucks and SUVs, the deaths of pedestrians and cyclists have risen significantly. SEPTA here in Philly has equal seating from Philadelphia County and 4 surrounding counties, the majority of which are all heavily suburbanized, so the area with the most people gets the least say in their public transit, to the point that we decided to spend several $billions on an extension to King of Prussia, which would serve around 10,000 people a day, as opposed to spending that same money on the Roosevelt subway system, which would serve around 100,000 people daily. But King of Prussia is a wealthy suburb, and Roosevelt Boulevard is just a bunch of poor city commoners. As an aside, a week after recording this, the federal government actually completely rejected funding the KOP project because it was unsustainable and financially inefficient compared to all the other projects that needed to be done to fix up the city's other public transit infrastructure. Living here in Philly, I'm very interested in figuring out how to make our city better and more livable. Oddly enough, other than protected bike lanes and public transit, most of the city and even most of neighboring Delaware County is rather compact. Probably the nicest suburbs I've ever seen. They still have single-family zoning, but it doesn't appear to include severely wasteful required lot sizes. However, in many places, such as the south and southwest areas of Philly, it's like an overpacked desert, no beauty at all, and it was one of the first glimpses I saw of the city when thinking about moving here, and was really scared I'd get depression because it was so ugly and barren of tree life. Where I ended up moving, 2 years after moving here, couldn't be further from that. This is my backyard. Just out of sheer luck, I happen to live in an apartment complex that's right along a city-forested park, and it's just beautiful. It made me think everyone should have this level of beauty in their life. I began wondering if there was a way to create a planned apartment complex or condo system citywide to ensure people get all the benefits of the city and the rural areas. There is 300 feet between the road in front of me and the one behind me. With this distance, there is enough tree growth that during the summer, I can't see my neighbors behind me. The apartment is 3 stories, but could easily still get as nice a view of the treetops with a 4th story. I began poking around on Google Maps, trying to figure out how to make this work, but for Philly and Delaware County, this wouldn't be possible because they're too compact. It would require decades to get something like this, and just slowly replacing old rotting buildings with green space and larger ones, which are currently happening, though the city needs to buy more empty lots and build more green space parks in the poorer areas. I thought this would have to be a planned new community thing until one day I was perusing Google Maps like a completely normal person does, and something clicked. While Delaware and Philly County don't use minimum lot sizes, Montgomery and Bucks counties, however, do, and have the ridiculously recessed front yard depending on the area. Behind the house is roughly 300 feet of mostly wooded area that are just gorgeous from bird's eye view at least. Look at all that wasted space in the front yard that makes infrastructure maintenance and mass transit way more expensive and more driving required to get basic needs. This, of course, couldn't be forced or use eminent domain, but the city could switch the zoning laws to allow for mixed-use buildings in the neighborhoods. They could also quite easily switch property taxes to lower taxes on the value of the house to higher taxes on the size of the land, just like the Georgists called for, of whom the original inventor of the game Monopoly was. All infrastructure from road length to wiring, water, steam, gas, fiber optics, to public transit miles to miles spent commuting is directly impacted by land size and barely impacted by the cost of the house. A 20 to 30 foot front yard would be rather worthless to developers, and a reasonable sized front yard if you have to have one. However, a 45 to 50 foot front yard that most often happens in R1 zoning areas would be incredibly useful to developers. This tax change could lead to homeowners to let a developer build a 4-story apartment or condo in their front yard. A 50-foot by 150-foot 4-story building could house 50 extra people in an area that currently holds an average of maybe 14 people. The bottom floor could be a storefront, office, or apartments. The next 3 floors could be apartments or offices depending on need. At first, they would probably only want to put in one apartment building in one lot to offset parking, but if this increased ridership for public transit over time, there wouldn't need to be as much parking. Kids could literally walk down to their corner store or the bodega to pick up something without worrying about getting hit or dying like we used to be able to do. And the corner store could be literally a grocery-sized store just a couple blocks away. This is an example of the 15 or 5-minute city, which drastically reduces car trips and needs for cars in general. If you like your big front yard, that's fine. You don't have to give it up, but don't force it on other people with R1 zoning laws and steal from the infrastructure budget of your city just because you want a massive wasteful front yard that you have to water and then mow using often incredibly unregulated polluting lawnmowers and leaf blowers. Once fully built up and developed, the former suburbs could have that Main Street look and feel to it in the front, but with a forested natural backyard like I have. Of course, the front yard of the original houses wouldn't have much of a view, but their backyard would be just as amazing. And they would no longer have to mow any yards or pay any taxes on that wasted recessed front yard. If there isn't currently a forested backyard, grow a neighborhood food forest, either community or city-owned. With less land, the taxes on the house will be much lower. Of course, most suburbs built during or after the 80s are utterly lacking in sidewalks and basic safe pedestrian infrastructure, much less biking infrastructure, and both require way less spending than road repair and maintenance. Take it to the next level and you could set up fences and nature corridors with overhead or underground bridges to let them move and migrate safely, if and where possible. Suburbs have the opportunity to have the best of both the rural and urban life, but instead have the worst of both. Of course, many like their suburban lives and believe it's safer, where it's that illusion of safety that shuts people's brains down and causes them to have more accidents in the suburbs than you would expect. Some like their big, gigantic yards because I guess they're masochists. NIMBYs will be completely against this, claiming it will destroy the character of their neighborhood. To which, in the suburbs, what character? Being isolated and having to drive everywhere? This is cultural stagnation. There is no character, and you're stealing from the rest of the city. What does need to be in place is that people on the block need to have buy-in on the aesthetics of the new multi-story buildings, so it will make up for the lack of open space. I have a friend who lives in an apartment with a great skyline in many directions, and 2 half quadrants were utterly destroyed by new luxury apartments. One is an ugly monstrosity that does nothing to make up for the lack of skyline. The other is done, however, in an artistically architectural fashion that will end up having a green roof once completed and might make up for the tree line she once enjoyed. There are ways to do this right that fixes the housing and climate crisis without losing any beauty, or at least supplement it, as well as replace a lot of ugly with some beauty. Or there are the normal cheapest ways to do it. Every member of the block should be allowed to vote on and decide proposed aesthetics to each building to ensure people don't end up feeling pushed out of their own neighborhood, hating the eyesore, and even have their property values drop. My neighborhood is an older historic German-style neighborhood, so that is the required aesthetic for any new building, because they quite rightly don't want a glaringly brutalist or industrial building breaking up the aesthetics of the neighborhood. These suburban streets could decide from the ground up what aesthetics and character they want for their neighborhood, instead of corporations deciding for them and giving them no choice. This may not work for all suburbs, but there are certainly other options without demolishing a single usable house. With this new burst of housing, we can stop the suburban expansion, ensuring farmers keep farming the land and only open up that land for development when we have actually efficiently used the land we already have, instead of wasting it like we currently do as a status symbol or the only way to get your kids into a good school. This requires public engagement and pushing to ensure we not only survive but thrive in cities and suburbs in the threat of climate change, hopefully helping to tackle much of the loneliness pandemic that R1 zoning and lack of mixed-use buildings and zones have caused. Cell phones are blamed on the loneliness pandemic, but it's actually car-centrism, and phones are the band-aids we use to deal with it. Current compact cities need more trees, more bike lanes and infrastructure like bike parking, more public transit and less cars to make them an amazing place to live in. It's estimated that a city could shut down 1 in 4 streets and make them exclusive to bikes, pedestrians, and public transit with priority at lights, and drivers would barely notice the loss of these streets over time as more and more people would shift over to walking, biking, and public transit because they actually want to, taking these big bulky cars that would be on the streets off the roads. This would drastically cut down on air pollution and smog, as well as the number of pedestrians and cyclists hit. Suburbs, on the other hand, need more mixed-use, multi-story buildings in currently wasteful, carbon-intensive, expensive, and initially racist front yards, and more trees and food forests in the back. Once these are built up, if the city has good public transit, the funding will be there to extend the biking, walking, and mass transit infrastructure needed. Everyone deserves beauty in nature and all the benefits that cities have. And this is required for tackling climate change. But tackling climate change doesn't necessarily mean you have to give up beauty. If anything, you are gaining community, health benefits, more free time from reduced commuting, architectural aesthetics, a gorgeous backyard for everyone, and all that's required to give up is a horrible front yard you have to mow. So as always, thank you all for watching this as a video or listening to this as a podcast, which I'm sure was completely uncontroversial to anyone, especially to the YouTube monetization team. So if you found this useful, please donate to my Patreon. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have almost 700 videos on my channel that I've made over the past 11 years on religion, science, psychology, and politics. Please go check them out, and if your site has the option, like, rate, review, and comment. A special thanks goes out to Kendall Copperberg, Mylon Mia, Ogrel, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Joe Taylor for their $10 or more Wapawet level donations. I'm always humbled by the fact that they find my work worth funding and worth driving me forward. Thank you all. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.